3:47 a.m., Lena Carter sat alone in a safe house, staring at the door that would never open. The man who promised to abandon his empire for her, Dominic Russo, the city's most feared mafia boss, was supposed to arrive hours ago so they could disappear forever. Instead, the morning news showed him marrying Victoria Laurent, daughter of a rival crime dynasty, in the most lavish wedding the underworld had ever seen. Lena watched it all on television, realizing she had spent the night waiting for a man who had chosen someone else. Her heart didn't break. It shattered into silence. If you're hooked by the story of betrayal and broken promises, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The television screen flickered in the pre-dawn darkness, casting ghostly shadows across Lena's face. She hadn't moved in over an hour. Couldn't move. The remote control had slipped from her fingers sometime around 4 a.m., clattering onto the cheap linoleum floor of the safe house, but she barely registered the sound. Her entire world had narrowed to the images playing out before her, images that were systematically destroying everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the man she had believed would change everything. The wedding footage played on loop across every news channel. Of course it did. When Dominic Russo married, the entire city paid attention. Lena watched as cameras captured him standing at the altar in a black tuxedo that probably cost more than she made in a year, his dark hair perfectly styled, his jaw set in that familiar hard line she had kissed so many times in the shadows. Beside him stood Victoria Laurent, breathtaking in a custom gown that sparkled under the cathedral lights, her smile radiant and triumphant as she claimed the city's most dangerous prize. The ceremony had taken place at St. Augustine's Cathedral, the same cathedral where Lena's parents had been married 30 years ago, back when her life was simple and dreams didn't come with body counts. In a stunning display of unity between two of the city's most powerful families, the reporter's voice chirped with barely contained excitement. Dominic Russo and Victoria Laurent were joined in matrimony last night in what insiders are calling the wedding of the decade. The union between the Russo and Laurent families is expected to reshape the city's entire power structure. Lena closed her eyes, but the images remained burned into her retinas. She had memorized every detail in the hours she'd been sitting here. The way Dominic's hand had rested on Victoria's lower back as they descended the cathedral steps. The champagne toast where he'd actually smiled, at something Victoria whispered in his ear. The first dance, elegant and practiced, as if they'd been partners their whole lives instead of political pawns in a game Lena had foolishly believed Dominic would refuse to play. 2 weeks ago, he had promised her everything. "Give me 2 weeks," he'd said, his forehead pressed against hers in the darkness of her apartment, his hands framing her face like she was something precious, instead of a secret he kept hidden from his world. 2 weeks to handle my father, to make the arrangements, to ensure we can disappear without leaving bodies behind. Then we walk away from all of this, the families, the violence, the empire. We start over somewhere they'll never find us. Just you and me, Lena. I swear it. She had believed him. The evidence of her stupidity sat packed in 2 suitcases by the door, everything she owned that mattered, condensed into luggage she could carry. She'd quit her job at Mercy General 3 days ago, telling her supervisor she was moving across the country to care for a sick relative. She'd broken her lease, donated most of her furniture, said goodbye to the few friends she'd made since moving to the city 5 years ago. She'd erased her entire life, prepared to become someone new, all because Dominic Russo had looked into her eyes and promised her forever. The safe house had been his idea. Neutral territory, he'd explained when he'd given her the address and the key 2 days ago. Somewhere my father's people won't be watching. Pack light, stay invisible, and wait for me. I'll be there by midnight on the 23rd. We'll be gone before sunrise. It was now 4:32 a.m. on the 24th. Dominic had married another woman 6 hours ago. And Lena sat alone in a dusty room that smelled of mildew and broken promises, watching her entire future crumble into ash. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, the 3rd time in the last hour. She didn't need to look to know it wasn't Dominic. The first 2 calls had been from Maya, her former roommate, and the closest thing to family she had in this city. Maya didn't know about Dominic. Nobody did. Their entire relationship had existed in shadows, stolen moments between the demands of his empire and the reality of her ordinary life. The phone went silent, then immediately buzzed again. This time Lena looked. Not a call. A notification. A bank transfer. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the screen, part of her already knowing what she would find, another part desperately hoping she was wrong. Transfer received $500,000. From D. Russo. Message, I'm sorry, take this and disappear. Don't try to contact me, it's safer this way. D. The phone slipped from her fingers. $500,000. The exact price Dominic Russo had placed on 6 months of whispered promises and stolen kisses. The price of her silence, her absence, her complete erasure from his life. Lena stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream. Her chest felt too tight, her lungs unable to draw enough air. The walls of the safe house pressed inward, suffocating her with their peeling paint and water-stained ceilings. She stumbled toward the window, yanked aside the dusty curtain, and stared out at the city beginning to wake under a slate-gray sky. Somewhere out there, Dominic Russo was probably in a honeymoon suite with his new wife, celebrating the merger that would make both families untouchable. And she was here, paid off, and dismissed like a problem solved. The rage came suddenly, burning through the numbness that had held her paralyzed for hours. It started in her chest and spread outward, hot and violent and absolutely consuming. Her hand found the remote control on the floor, and before conscious thought could intervene, she hurled it at the television screen. Glass shattered. Sparks flew. The images of Dominic and Victoria froze mid-dance, then died in a shower of electronic snow. The silence that followed was deafening. Lena sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and finally, let herself cry. Not delicate tears, but great gasping sobs that tore from her throat and shook her entire body. She cried for the future she'd imagined, for the man she'd believed existed beneath the monster everyone else feared, for the naive woman she'd been who had actually thought love could conquer the kind of darkness that lived in Dominic Russo's world. She cried until there was nothing left inside her but a hollow ache and the bitter taste of betrayal. When the tears finally stopped, dawn had broken fully over the city. Lena pulled herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, her eyes swollen and burning. She caught her reflection in the mirror hanging crookedly on the opposite wall, a pale ghost of herself, dark circles under red-rimmed eyes, her chestnut hair a tangled mess around her shoulders. She looked like someone who had died and hadn't realized it yet. The thought should have broken her further. Instead, it sparked something cold and hard in her chest, something that felt almost like clarity. Dominic Russo had made his choice. He had chosen power over love, duty over freedom, a strategic alliance over the woman he claimed had changed his life. And he had done it without even having the courage to tell her to her face. Lena's gaze fell on her phone, still lying on the floor where she'd dropped it, the screen cracked but still glowing with that obscene transfer notification. $500,000. Blood money, she thought bitterly. Payment for services rendered. The going rate for a mistress who knew too much and needed to vanish. But as she stared at the number, an idea began to form, cold and calculated and completely unlike anything Lena Carter, pediatric nurse and eternal optimist, had ever considered before. Dominic thought he could pay her to disappear quietly. He thought he could erase their entire relationship with a bank transfer and a dismissive text message. He thought she would simply fade away, heartbroken and compliant, while he built his empire with Victoria Laurent at his side. He was wrong. Lena picked up her phone, her fingers surprisingly steady as she opened her messages. She typed quickly before she could second-guess herself, before the part of her that still loved him could interfere. I'll take your money, but I won't disappear quietly. You want me gone? You're going to have to face me first. She hit send before she could lose her nerve. The response came almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting, phone in hand. Lena, don't. It's not safe. Just take the money and go, please. Her laugh was harsh and humorless. Please. As if he had the right to ask her for anything after what he'd done. The Laurent reception is tonight at the Elysium Hotel. I'll be there. If you want me gone from your life, you can tell me to my face why you chose her. She didn't wait for his response. She silenced her phone, slipped it into her pocket, and turned toward her packed suitcases. She had 12 hours to prepare. 12 hours to transform from the heartbroken woman crying on the floor of a safe house into someone capable of walking into the lion's den and demanding answers from the man who had destroyed her. 12 hours to decide if she was brave enough to do something utterly insane. She was. 6 months earlier, Lena's life had been pleasantly, almost aggressively normal. She worked the night shift at Mercy General Hospital, specializing in pediatric emergency care. She had a tiny apartment in a neighborhood that was almost trendy, a roommate who baked experimental desserts and left passive-aggressive notes about dish duty, and a dating life that could charitably be described as non-existent. She was content, maybe not happy in the soul-deep way people wrote poems about, but satisfied. Fulfilled by her work, if not by the rest of her existence. That all changed on a Tuesday night in March, when the ambulance bay doors crashed open and 2 men carried in a third who was bleeding out from a gunshot wound to the chest. "GSW to the upper left quadrant," one of the EMTs shouted as they rushed the gurney through the doors. "Vitals are crashing. He's lost a lot of blood." Lena was already moving, her training overriding everything else. She fell into step beside the gurney, her practiced eyes assessing the patient even as they rushed him toward Trauma 1. Male, approximately 30 years old, well-dressed despite the blood soaking his white shirt. Dark hair, strong features, unconscious but fighting. She could see his hands clenching and unclenching even in his semi-conscious state, as if his body refused to give up even when his mind had checked out. "Pressure's dropping," one of the nurses called out. "We're losing him." "Not on my watch," Lena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had pulled countless people back from death's door. "Get me O-negative blood now," and somebody paged Dr. Reeves. No doctors. The voice came from one of the men who had carried the patient in. Tall, built like a boxer, with cold eyes that had probably seen more death than anyone in this hospital. He stepped between Lena and the trauma room door, his hand resting meaningfully on his jacket where she could clearly see the outline of a weapon. "Excuse me?" Lena's eyes narrowed. "Your friend is dying. He needs a surgeon. He needs you to save his life without asking questions and without involving anyone else." The man pulled out a thick envelope and held it out. "There's $50,000 here. You stabilize him, remove the bullet, stitch him up, and forget you ever saw his face. Can you do that?" Every instinct Lena had screamed at her to refuse, to call security, to follow protocol and report this obvious criminal situation to the authorities. But then the patient on the gurney made a sound, a low, pained groan that spoke of agony beyond bearing, and her eyes met his as they flickered open for just a moment. Dark eyes, impossibly dark like the ocean at midnight, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Not menace, not cruelty, desperation. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please." Lena looked from him to the man with the envelope to the nurses who had stopped in the doorway, waiting for her decision. She knew this was wrong, knew she should refuse, should call for help, should follow every rule and regulation that governed her profession, but something in those dark eyes held her captive. "Everyone out," she heard herself say. "I'll handle this." The nurses exchanged glances but didn't argue. They'd worked with Lena long enough to know that when she used that tone, there was no point in debate. The man with the envelope smiled slightly and placed the money on the counter. "You're smart. That's good. We'll be right outside. You have 2 hours." Then they were gone, and Lena was alone with a dying stranger who looked at her like she was his last hope in a world that had clearly tried to kill him. "Okay," she said quietly, moving to his side and examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "You're going to tell me your name, you're going to stay conscious, and you're going to live through this. Understood?" He managed something that might have been a smile. "Dominic," he said. "My name is Dominic." "Well, Dominic," Lena said, already reaching for the instruments she would need. "You've made some very bad life choices. But tonight isn't the night you pay for them. Tonight, you live." She worked with the kind of focused intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. The bullet had missed his heart by less than an inch. He should have been dead before he reached the hospital. But somehow, impossibly, he'd held on. Stubborn, she thought. This man was too stubborn to die. She removed the bullet, a clean extraction, thankfully, with minimal additional damage. She repaired the torn tissue, closed the wound in careful layers, administered antibiotics and pain medication. And through it all, Dominic stayed conscious, his dark eyes following her movements with an intensity that should have been unsettling but somehow wasn't. "You're good at this," he said at one point, his voice stronger despite the trauma his body had endured. "I'd better be," Lena replied, not looking up from her sutures. "You're paying me a year's salary for 2 hours of work. Worth every penny." He paused, then added, "What's your name?" She should have refused to answer, should have maintained the professional distance that would make it easier to forget this night had ever happened. But those eyes were on her again, and she found herself answering despite her better judgment. "Lena." "Lena," he repeated like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. "You just saved my life, Lena. I'm a nurse. It's literally my job description. Not like this." His hand moved, faster than she would have thought possible given his injury, and caught her wrist. His grip was gentle but firm, his skin warm against hers. Most people would have called the police, turned me in, let me die rather than risk being involved with someone like me. "Someone like you?" Lena met his gaze squarely. "I don't know anything about you, Dominic, except that you're stubborn enough to stay alive when you should have bled out 20 minutes ago." His thumb traced a small circle on the inside of her wrist, and she felt her pulse jump in response. A reaction that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with the dangerous electricity she could feel crackling between them. "You're better off not knowing," he said quietly. "Trust me." She should have agreed, should have finished her work, taken the money, and walked away from Dominic and whatever darkness surrounded him. Instead, she heard herself say, "What if I want to know?" Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something he saw in her that she hadn't known existed. "Then you're braver than you are smart," he said, "or maybe crazier than both." Lena pulled her wrist free and returned to her sutures. "I've been called worse." When she finally finished, nearly 2 hours had passed. Dominic's color had improved, his breathing steady, his vitals stable. He would need rest, antibiotics, and careful monitoring, but he would live. She helped him sit up, her hands steady on his shoulders as he winced through the movement. "You need to take it easy for at least a week," she instructed, slipping into the familiar comfort of medical directives. "No strenuous activity, change the dressing twice daily, watch for signs of infection. Lena." She stopped talking. His hand found hers again, and this time she didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made something in her chest tighten. "You didn't have to help me. You took a risk tonight that most people wouldn't take." "Yeah, well," she said, trying to maintain some semblance of professional distance even as her fingers curled around his. "I'm apparently crazier than I am smart." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from dangerous to devastating, and Lena felt her world tilt on its axis. She should have walked away. She didn't. "Can I see you again?" Dominic asked. "When I'm not bleeding out?" "That depends," Lena said. "Are you going to tell me what happened tonight? Who shot you and why?" His smile faded. "That's not a conversation you want to have, Lena. Trust me." "Stop telling me what I want." She squeezed his hand once, then let go. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting from the truth." "No," he agreed, his eyes searching her face like he was trying to memorize every detail. "You're definitely not fragile. But the truth about my world," he shook his head, "it's darker than you can imagine. Try me." He studied her for a long moment, and Lena had the strange sense that she was being evaluated, weighed against some internal standard she couldn't see. Finally, he reached into his pocket, moving carefully because of his injury, and pulled out a business card. Plain white, expensive cardstock, with nothing but a phone number embossed in black ink. "Call me," he said. "Tomorrow or next week, or whenever you decide whether you really want to know who I am. But understand this, Lena. Once you make that call, there's no going back to your normal life. Everything changes." She took the card, her fingers brushing his. "Maybe I'm ready for things to change." "Be sure," Dominic said, his voice low and serious. "Because I'm the kind of man your mother warned you about. The kind who brings danger instead of flowers, complications instead of stability. If you call me, you need to understand what you're getting into." Lena slipped the card into her pocket and met his eyes without flinching. I saved your life tonight, Dominic. I think I've already proven I can handle danger. His answering smile was equal parts admiration and warning. We'll see about that. The men who had brought him in returned exactly 2 hours later, as promised. They helped Dominic to his feet, supporting him despite his obvious determination to walk on his own. At the door, he turned back one last time. Don't forget, he said. Once you call, everything changes. I won't forget, Lena promised, and she didn't. 3 days later, after 3 sleepless nights spent staring at that business card and telling herself all the reasons she should throw it away, she made the call. Dominic answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. Lena. Just her name spoken in that deep voice, and she felt something ignite in her chest. I want to know, she said. I want to know who you are and what your world looks like. Even if it's dark? Especially if it's dark. He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear something that might have been satisfaction in his breathing. There's a restaurant on 5th Street called Salvatore's, he finally said. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. Come alone. Wear something that makes you feel powerful. Why? Because you're about to walk into my world, Lena. And I need you to understand from the beginning that you're not a victim. You're choosing this. You're choosing me. She should have been frightened, should have heard the warning in his words and ended the call. Instead, she found herself smiling. Tomorrow night, she confirmed. 8 o'clock. Tomorrow night, he agreed. And Lena? Don't be late. I'm not a patient man. The line went dead, and Lena was left standing in her apartment, heart racing, phone pressed to her ear, wondering what the hell she had just agreed to. She was about to find out. Tomorrow night, everything would change. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly the kind of change she'd been waiting for her entire life. She ignored the other voice, the one that warned her that some changes were irreversible, that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. That voice sounded too much like fear, and Lena Carter had never been the kind of woman who let fear make her decisions. Not then. Not yet. Salvatore's wasn't the kind of restaurant that advertised. You either knew about it or you didn't belong there. Lena discovered this when she tried to look it up online and found nothing. No website, no reviews, not even a mention in the city's dining guides. Just an address on 5th Street and a phone number that went to voicemail. She almost didn't go. Standing in front of her closet the next evening, staring at clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate for whatever she was about to walk into, Lena questioned every decision that had led to this moment. She was a nurse. A good one. She had a simple life, a safe life, and she was about to risk it all for a man she'd spent exactly 2 hours with while he bled on her operating table. Wear something that makes you feel powerful, Dominic had said. Lena reached for the black dress in the back of her closet, the one she'd bought on impulse 2 years ago and never worn because it felt too bold, too sophisticated for her ordinary existence. Silk that draped like water, a neckline that suggested without revealing, a hemline that ended just above her knees. She put it on and barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked confident, dangerous even. Someone who could walk into a mysterious restaurant and demand answers from a man who'd warned her about darkness. Someone brave enough to choose the unknown over the safe. Lena arrived at Salvatore's at exactly 8 o'clock. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of an old brownstone, its windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked any view inside. No sign announced its presence. Only the address numbers mounted beside a discreet black door confirmed she'd found the right place. She knocked, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door opened immediately, and a man in an immaculate suit looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that probably detected weapons and weaknesses in equal measure. Name? His voice was flat, professional, revealing nothing. Lena Carter. I'm meeting. We know who you're meeting. He stepped aside, gesturing her into a dimly lit foyer. This way, please. The interior of Salvatore's bore no resemblance to any restaurant Lena had ever entered. The lighting was deliberately low, casting everything in amber shadows. Heavy velvet curtains divided the space into private alcoves where she could hear the murmur of conversation without seeing the speakers. Classical music played softly, almost imperceptibly beneath the other sounds. And everywhere, at every table, standing at strategic points throughout the room, were men who looked like they could kill you before your appetizer arrived. Lena's escort led her through the main dining room toward a private section in the back. She could feel eyes following her progress, could sense the weight of attention from the shadowed alcoves. Whoever these people were, they noticed everything. "He's waiting for you," the man said, pulling back a curtain to reveal a small private dining room. Dominic sat at a table set for two, a glass of wine in his hand, looking completely at ease in this world of shadows and silent threats. He'd traded the blood-stained white shirt for a dark suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his hair styled with casual perfection, his dark eyes tracking her movement as she stepped into the room. He stood as she entered, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed incongruous with everything else about him. Lena. Her name was a greeting and an acknowledgement and something else she couldn't quite identify. "You came. You told me not to be late." She moved toward the table, refusing to show the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "I'm very punctual." His smile was brief but genuine. "I've noticed. You're exactly on time, which means you probably arrived 5 minutes early and waited outside to make sure you walked in at precisely 8 o'clock. She flushed slightly, irritated that he'd read her so accurately. "How's your wound?" "Healing perfectly, thanks to an excellent nurse." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit. We have a lot to talk about." Lena sat, hyper-aware of the intimacy of the space, the heavy curtain that blocked them from view, the single candle flickering between them, the way Dominic watched her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. A server appeared silently, poured her wine, and vanished before she could say thank you. "You said you wanted to know who I am," Dominic began without preamble. "So let me ask you first, what do you think you know?" Lena considered the question, took a sip of wine that tasted expensive and complex. "I know you got shot and couldn't go to a regular hospital. I know you travel with armed guards and eat at restaurants that don't officially exist. I know you paid me $50,000 in cash to keep quiet about your injury." She met his eyes directly. "So I'm guessing you're either very rich, very dangerous, or both." "Both," he confirmed without hesitation. "Does that scare you?" "Should it?" "Yes." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Lena, I meant what I said about my world being dark. I'm not exaggerating or trying to be mysterious. I'm the head of one of the most powerful crime families in this city, the Russo family. We control territory, we settle disputes, we enforce rules that the police can't or won't enforce. Some people call us the mafia. Others just call us dangerous." His words should have sent her running. Instead, they crystallized something she'd already suspected, made real what she'd only guessed at. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "Because you asked." Dominic's fingers traced the stem of his wine glass. "And because if you're going to be in my life, you need to understand exactly what that means. I don't do lies, Lena, not with people who matter." "And I matter?" The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. His eyes met hers, dark and intense. "From the moment you decided to save my life instead of following the rules, you mattered." The server returned with their first course, something elegant and artfully plated that Lena barely registered. The food wasn't why she was here. "Tell me how you got shot," she said, pushing her plate aside. Dominic smiled slightly at her directness. "There's a rival family, the Castellanos. They've been trying to expand into Russo territory for months. 3 nights ago, one of their soldiers thought he'd earn points by taking me out during a meeting that was supposed to be neutral ground." He shrugged, the movement careful because of his healing injury. "He got off one shot before my people put him down. I got lucky. The bullet missed everything vital." "That's not luck," Lena said. "That's a miracle. Another inch to the right, and you'd have bled out before the ambulance arrived." "Then I guess I owed someone a miracle." His expression softened. "Or maybe you were my miracle, Lena. The universe's way of saying it wasn't my time yet." She should have scoffed at the sentimentality. Instead, she felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "What happened to the man who shot you?" "He's dead." Dominic's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion. "That's how this world works. Someone tries to kill you, you eliminate the threat." "Just like that?" Lena heard the judgment in her own voice and couldn't suppress it. "Someone dies and it's just business as usual?" "Yes." He didn't flinch from her reaction. "I told you it was dark, Lena. This is what I mean. In my world, violence isn't an aberration. It's the language we speak. And I'm very fluent in it. She should have been horrified, should have thrown down her napkin and walked out, back to her safe, normal life where people didn't discuss murder over expensive wine. But something in his honesty held her there. He wasn't trying to romanticize his life or make himself seem heroic. He was showing her the truth, unflinching and ugly, giving her every reason to leave, which made her want to stay all the more. "Why did you want to see me again?" she asked instead. "You could have just paid me and disappeared. Why risk bringing me into your world?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still tracing that slow pattern on his wine glass. When he spoke, his voice was lower, more intimate. "Because for 2 hours, while you were saving my life, I saw something in you that I've never seen before. Courage without calculation. Compassion without weakness. You looked at me, a stranger covered in blood who could have been anyone, and you chose to help instead of protect yourself." He paused. "Do you know how rare that is? Real courage? Most people in my world only act brave when the odds are in their favor, but you gambled everything on a stranger's life." "I'm a nurse," Lena said, trying to deflect the intensity of his words. "Saving lives is what I do." "No." He shook his head. "You're a woman who risks everything for what she believes is right. That's not training, Lena. That's character. And it's the most dangerous and beautiful thing I've ever seen." The air between them felt charged, electric. Lena's pulse quickened, and she knew he could see it in the flutter of her throat. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Not really." "Then let me." Dominic reached across the table, his hand extended palm up in invitation. "Let me know you, Lena. Let me see if that courage I saw in the emergency room is real or if it was just adrenaline and good training." She should have refused, should have kept the distance that would protect her when this inevitably ended badly. Instead, she placed her hand in his, felt his fingers close around hers with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about the violence he was capable of. "I'm not looking for a relationship," she said, even as her fingers tightened around his. "I don't date criminals." His smile was slow and devastating. "I'm not asking you to date me, Lena. I'm asking you to see me. The man beneath the monster. The person I am when the violence stops and the world goes quiet." "And who are you when the world goes quiet?" "Lonely," he admitted, and the raw honesty in that single word broke something open inside her chest.